And there's good and bad news for supermarket shoppers this morning. The bad news, supply costs increased 8.8% in May 2023. But the good news is that momentum in these costs increases to supermarkets is easing. So what does that mean for us? Well, we have the principal economist from the company that conducted the research, Infometrics, Brad Olsen. Morning, Brad.
Good morning.
So what does this all mean for us?
Well, we know that those increasing supply costs to supermarkets obviously has an effect on what the cost that consumers will be paying for food. And although we're still seeing those costs increase, 8.8% like you said in May, that's the first time it's been below 10% in quite a few months. And in fact, we've been quite worried at just how sustained some of those higher increases had been in recent months. They continued to show those inflationary pressures that were coming through. And of course, we're continuing to see those cost pressures push through the supply chain from producers themselves, then into supermarkets, and then on to consumers. The latest data, though, showing a more restrained or certainly more normalising picture of cost increases. Now, under no illusions is this a fall in costs or fall in prices. It's just they're not going up at such a frantic pace. In May, we saw a 0.4% monthly increase. Again, if you annualise that, if you took that over a year, you'd be looking at something around the 5% mark. But previously, we were seeing 1% monthly gains, which extrapolated out was getting you towards those sort of double-digit increases. So we're not seeing that those supply costs are increasing at quite as frantic of a pace. And although we're not expecting that food prices become a lot cheaper anytime soon, we are hopeful that these trends might imply that in the next few months, we might see not quite as fast increases when it comes to supermarket prices.
So they might not be getting cheaper, but how much are they going to get more expensive by, or are they going to get more expensive by?
There does still seem to be a lot of momentum behind these cost increases, just again, not nearly as much as there was before. And given we're still in what seems to be a very intense inflationary environment, you sort of take the win when you start to see that shift in momentum. When we've looked through the figures, we can see that both global and domestic pricing pressures are still higher, but again, not as quite as intense. You've seen diesel prices, for example, that have continued to moderate away a touch. The likes of global food prices as well that have started to take a little bit of a step back. And when you look at the likes of on-farm costs to New Zealand producers, for example, they're still up at, eye-watering growth rates of sort of 11, 12% per annum. But that's slightly better than the 15% per annum or so that you saw a few quarters back. So still a lot of those intense pricing and cost pressures coming through. And of course, if you're starting to see that on farm, if you're still seeing higher wage costs, if you're seeing the likes of packaging and repairs that continue to cost more, of course, those higher costs are passed through the supply chain, and that's what's starting or continuing to come through when it comes to New Zealand food prices. So when we're looking at this momentum, really that step change is also coming through because of how large the increase was last year. Back in May 2022, we saw a very large 1.3, 1.4% monthly increase. That was the largest on record. Like I said, 0.4% monthly increase this time round. A definite slowing of momentum, but still in the top quarter of all increases that we've looked at. So not out of the woods yet, but maybe that tide is turning.
Do supermarkets absorb any of these costs, or do they offload it directly onto the consumer?
It's going to depend a lot, sort of good by good, what New Zealanders are buying, what different supply deals might be with various producers, whether or not they're able to get enough. We saw, of course, after the cyclone, a considerable lift in particularly produce prices. Certainly supply costs for produce were up well over 20% a few months back. They now have pulled back just a touch, again, in terms of growth rate. But we saw as well, when we looked through some of the detailed items, the likes of avocados and cucumber supply costs were up considerably. And at the same time, it's not just produce either, it's a number of other goods. Frozen goods in general have lifted across the board. And we also had a look at grocery supply costs for sort of other non-fresh items, and you could see the likes of pet food and chocolate supply costs all having risen. So generally what we're seeing is that all of that does push through the supply chain. It stems all the way back to COVID-19 supply chain issues. It looks at, it takes into account the Russian invasion of Ukraine and what that's done to fertilizer prices and fuel prices. It does seem to be continuing to push through. And of course, those suppliers themselves being faced with very real costs, they're having to pass it on. The costs that supermarkets are then bearing has also risen, and so they're passing it on across the board. That's where that inflationary pressure has become so persistent.
So as a shopper who might be doing the shopping today, are we going to see those prices affected from today, and what do we need to look out for? What should we possibly be having to change to in order to maybe save some costs?
I certainly don't think it will come through quite as quickly. The grocery supply cost index that we put together looks at 60,000 items across the entire range at foodstuff supermarkets. But the likes of the Stats NZ Food Price Index, which will be released later this week, only looks at a few hundred of the top items. So they're not quite apples with apples. We have had a bit of a preliminary look at the food price index, and some of the largest increases in there are likely to fall out into the comparison period in the next few months. Again, that doesn't mean that anyone will see cheaper food prices, and again, those supply costs are still up. But you would be hoping that in the second half of 2023, on the current numbers, that maybe when people are going to the supermarket in that second half of the year, they might be going, wow, that's still expensive, but it hasn't increased quite as much between shops as it has in previous times. All of that being said, people are still making some very difficult decisions about how to put food on the table. There's not really any particularly cheap areas anymore. When we've looked previously at the food price index, we've seen that it's, healthy vegetables and similar to put a salad on the table that are expensive. But 2-minute noodles had also increased 19% over the last year. So it is difficult. I don't think there's a lot of budgeting options out there for Kiwi families trying to put the essentials on the table. Certainly as we go into winter, that seasonal shopping and similar is important, but I dare expect most households who are already under pressure are looking at how they save in every which way they can.
Definitely. Thank you so much, Brad. That's Infometrics Principal Economist Brad Olsen.